Anne-Marie James, hello.
Hi Kate, hi.
How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, I'm really good. I'm really excited to be talking to you on the occasion of your online show with Richard Saltoun Gallery. It's part of this fantastic series they're doing called Women 2.1. Your show is Musee Imaginaire, which is a selection of works from this incredible body of work. So I'm really excited to do a bit of a deep dive into. You know, I'm a huge fan of them. As part of my job at Soho House and the curator of the NED, I've been acquiring the works wherever I can, like a magpie, grabbing them. I think it's such a interesting body of work. You're an artist who is very interested in art history. You absorb all of these cultural references and these sources, and then you reformulate, refashion them, investigate them, and present something sort of entirely new that becomes your own. It's a very research-based practice. And I guess I'm curious, before we get into the specificities of the work on display online, to know where you think this impulse came from, to look back and to use other creative minds as a starting point for your own journey.
Oh, big question. Well, I like to think of using found imagery as kind of a conversation with the past, just being one point in a cultural conversation that goes all the way back to antiquity and ancient Greece and Rome, and will continue past me through the viewer being the next stop along. And I kind of came up with the idea of working with the found during my first degree, my BA at Central St Martin's. At that point, I was working with film and video. So I came up with the idea of working with pre-existing material, but it was recutting books and it was recutting Hollywood movies. So I made a piece with The Graduate.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I recut Dustin Hoffman's voice, which at the time was really, really, really difficult to do. I remember at the beginning of the third year, because video took a lot longer, it was a lot more difficult. You could do the same piece that I made for my final year degree show now. You could probably make that in a few hours, an afternoon on your iPhone. But then it took ages. So I had to watch The Graduate and look for first I looked for the words I wanted, cut them all up, put them together. They didn't make sense, didn't sound like a voice. And it sounded like a robot. So I went back and picked out individual phonetic sounds to build this quote, which was a quote by Rosalind Krauss. It was condemned to repeating as if by compulsion the logically fraudulent original. So I think I've always been interested in the idea of originality being completely impossible.
That's so interesting when I love when I meet an artist and I hear about their graduate project and that it has so many resonances for what they're going to spend the next 10, 20, 30 years doing. I mean, that quote alone from Rosalind Krauss, such an important theorist. And then to see the way that you went about making it, I mean, is it strange to you that so much of your concern is already there when you're what, like 20, 21?
I spent most of that degree process just reaching that one point, the idea of recutting the found. But I got there as an artist who's really into drawing and painting, which was deeply unpopular and unfashionable at the time. And I thought, I want to draw and I want to use this skill that I've built, but not until I found like the idea, the reason. And I thought that would happen in like the first year or the first few months or maybe by the end. And I didn't paint or draw for the entire time I was there. And for quite some time afterwards, I tried every medium. I tried photography. There was a brief textiles phase. There was some very dodgy performance. There was all sorts of stuff to reach the point where I married the idea of recutting the found and exploring that idea of originality using other artists' work with the skill and the interest in the medium, painting and drawing.
It's interesting to me as well that you're so explicit about your sources and it's celebratory and you kind of take us as a viewer on a journey with you. You've already said that this is a jumping off point, you know, you're going all the way back maybe to like ancient Greece, but really the conversation carries on with you and actually through you to your viewers. So you're very inclusive and open and almost kind of very democratic about your sources, wanting to share them. And that in itself is quite unusual, because there's a lot of artists that are quite nervous about talking about their influences, particularly from other artists. And in fact, I know artists that if they're building a body of work for an exhibition, they won't even go into a gallery. You know, the last place they want to go is the National Gallery. There's seemingly somehow like someone else's originality will rub off onto them and take away some of their own. Is a sort of weird superstition that some artists have of wanting to stay entirely original and almost be kind of hermetic. And I get that, and it's a particular kind of practice, and it's a lovely, you know, artist neuroses, whereas yours is almost the opposite of that. You're very explicit about your sources, and I feel in a way that I learn through your work. I mean, I know you're not being here to be didactic or anything, but what is it, do you think, about the sentiment of your practice that means you're so unlike that other mode of thinking, which is like trying to close off and not be influenced? Because we're so interested in the idea of originality, and that in and of itself is one of your subjects.
Yeah, I think it's realizing as soon as I got to art school that there is no original thought. That's just not on the table. It's not possible. So where do you go from there? And for me, I started looking towards things that I really, really love, that I resonate with, and having a conversation with them. And that's kind of the process, is the conversation with the thing. So by the end of the process, not so much with the works we're focusing on today, because they're drawings made directly onto images of the artworks themselves, but when I'm making a series of paintings, you start with the source image, and the thing you end up with looks nothing like, say, Hokusai's Wave. I made a series based on Hokusai's Wave, and you can see that it's built from Hokusai's Wave, and there's hundreds of them in there, but it doesn't look like it, like a medium and a material or a brush mark. So yeah, an artwork that I'm referencing becomes as much a medium as the paint and the tools.
That's so interesting. And actually that brings us nicely to the Musee Imaginaire series, which is the exhibition that you have on at the moment, which is, you know, very direct in its source material. So the Musée Imaginaire is written in the 1950s by this French theorist, André Marot. His ambition, I suppose, was to put together like an encyclopedia of, you know, extraordinary objects. Here it is. I'm so desperate to talk to you about this, having seen so many of these works. So you got yourself a first edition, which is something we have to talk about in a second as well. And then you start taking the plates and then reworking them in your own hands. So this is very handmade work. To go back to your sort of original point about the fear of the handmade, you know, the particular fashion when you were at college was sort of resisting the hand of the artist. So this is very much the hand of the artist. And he wasn't an artist himself. He was assembling cultural treasures. And it was almost like it's sometimes translated as the museum without walls. So it's the idea that, you know, this in itself is this whole world, this sort of creative world, and you might see an object from China, you might see something from ancient Rome, and there'll be plenty of things that we all recognize, great icons of, you know, of shared cultural collective consciousness, and then things which are more obscure, and put them all together. So I suppose my first question has to be, where did you come across this? Because it's not particularly well known, I would say, considering what it is. Where did you first come across it, and what was it that appealed so much?
Well, actually, art history isn't really taught as part of, I mean, it's touched upon, but in terms of theory in art colleges in the UK, generally it's more about theories and current practitioners, people working today, and the very, very recent past, or it was certainly at St Martin's and Chelsea and Wimbledon where I went. So we weren't taught art history at all. So yeah, I heard about it from another curator who had studied art history, who came to visit me at the studio, and she said she'd seen some earlier works on paper, which were drawings directly onto studies, small clay studies made by Bernini. And she said, she'd seen some of those, and she said, "Oh, of course, you must see the Museum Without Walls. You must know this book." And I said, "I've never heard of it at all. What is it?" And she described it as sort of a fantasy art collection where somebody had pulled together all the great work from art history into one volume in the 50s, and built these relationships between the works, so between the pages, facing pages, and I was just, I couldn't see a copy of it because it's so old. So when I went to search for it on the internet, I couldn't see what it was. So I bought one on a hunch that this really was a special thing. And then when it arrived in the post, I was just amazed by it. So it was really the idea that somebody would do this, somebody would build this fantasy art collection, which is quite because it's pretty exhaustive. It's massive.
So how many plates are there in it?
I forget. I think it's in somewhere around 800, 600.
Because I see on the exhibition that you've got like plate, I don't know, 660 or something. So I knew that there was a lot. I knew that there were hundreds.
Yeah, we've got 704.
Wow, okay. And so does he put them chronologically, or does he put them by region in the world? Does he put them by medium? You know, how do you even begin to catalogue that?
Yeah, so they're grouped by, so there's like Rome, and then there's everything in Rome. And
right.
then,
the Capitoline wolf there, yeah.
And then there's sort of an oceanic section, Japan as a section. So they're kind of grouped by period, but also by area of the world, geographically.
So is this your reference copy, and then you have another one where you cut out the plates, right? Because I recognize some of those that you've worked on. So you bought a first edition?
Yes. Was
that hard to get hold of?
No, this is a first edition as well.
Well, you just got the first editions knocking around there, love.
They cost a little bit, but not a lot. Well, considering it's a body of work with potentially 700 pieces in it when I finish the lot, which is my dream, is to rework the whole thing.
How many have you done, do you think?
We showed about 60 in the first show, which was in Winterthur in Switzerland, and that was in 2013. And then I made a series of collages. I think there's maybe 30 of those. I've made over 100, maybe 120, 130, and rejected a few along the way, and the second copy.
Right. I was going to ask you this, what your success rate is, because it's interesting, isn't it? The idea of literally, like, I know this is not considered a work of art, but it is a cultural object. It's a curiosity. I think it's going to get more and more important, particularly now we live in the world that we live in, which we have to talk about, which is the fact that everyone's talking about virtual museums and the experience of trying to pull together collections, creative experiences, museum-worthy experiences without being in the physical presence of the art, which is, you know, effectively what your show is now online, which adds this whole level of irony. But I think it's not, you know, fantastically well known, but at the same time, you get this book, you know, and it's already 70 years old, and it is a kind of cultural project. What's it like the first time you get the scalpel out and you're like, right, I'm going to go at this? Because you're not doing what Jake and Dinos Chapman do when they destroy the Goyas. It's not about, there's nothing destructive. It feels like your work is, you know, you're adding to the conversation. And you're certainly, I think, in a way, raising this object as something which is worthwhile and interesting, but still, surely there must be a bit of trepidation when you first start making the work.
Definitely, massively. Previously, I have on previous series just taken the scalpel to it myself and taken the pages out to work on each one, and sometimes worked in the book directly and then cut them out at the end. But with this, I knew I wanted to rework the entire thing. And it's quite a monster to cut a piece. And I was just so nervous about it that I actually took it to a bookbinder and had them use a guillotine to cut the spine off.
Because they're so perfect, your works. I mean, they exist in this little pristine world of their own. And you've worked on the pages in a variety of, or the plates in a variety of ways. So talk us through the different techniques. You talked about collage already. A lot of it obviously is drawing, but what's the material you're using, and the, you know, the works that look like these beautiful threads? Tell us about how you're actually making these things.
Well, with the first ones, I was just really drawing directly onto the book pages.
But using what? Ink, pencil?
I've dug some stuff up. I thought this question might come up, so I dug out some of the things I was working with.
You know I'm thorough. You know I'm a bit of a geek.
For basic stuff, it's that's my kind of go-to pen.
Okay, lovely.
Which is like a dipping pen, which is pretty retro. And then just watercolors, different brands and kinds of ink, acrylic, really sort of fluid acrylic. So it's all acrylic, it's all water-based, and then different mediums. So mediums can change the viscosity of acrylic, and they're kind of the binder, what paint is before you put pigment in.
Yeah.
It's kind of like PVA, but really expensive.
So if someone was to try and do this with a book today, so like if they got hold of, I don't know, Gombrick, you know, latest edition, I think it's Fiden who print it, isn't it? Their experience wouldn't be anywhere the same as your experience, because these books from the 1950s, the way that they're printed and the quality of the pages must surely be very different to today's digital imagery and the paper and the way we print it.
It is very different, and interesting that you mentioned Gombrick actually, because the other day I've had for ages this, as an aside, desire to make something based on Artissima's work, and I thought, oh, I need to find it in a book, an old book, or a book about art history. It must be in Gombrick, and of course she's not in there.
There's no women.
No women in there at all. Pretty shocking. And now I've forgotten what the question was. I'm sorry.
We were just talking about if you were trying to do it today, and like the quality of that 1950s. It's 1957, isn't it, that he made it? Yeah.
It's actually, you might do probably better with a contemporary book, but it would have a very different feel, because their books are often coated. So usually the books I work on are so old that the paper isn't coated. So it just means it's a bit more absorbent.
Yeah.
And you have to maybe go over lines a few times with acrylic, and acrylic inks work better than ink, which tends to seep in and spread. It's about getting to know the paper quality a little bit, and the only way to do that is just do it and
take the plunge. So you mentioned Artemisia Gentileschi there, of course, the fantastic woman artist. She's had a great long overdue exhibition at the National Gallery, and they've just acquired a new work by her, and she is, you know, in the sort of top 5 historic artists working after Caravaggio, a really independent, you know, fantastic woman working for all the different courts in Europe. And yet, you know, it's very difficult to find her. And I'm imagining that there aren't really any objects that we know are by women makers or women artists in the Musee Imaginaire. So what or maybe I'm wrong, but if they are, they're not many.
I think that's a really interesting question, because a lot of the work is, one thing that's really interesting about Musée Imaginaire is that he's got this idea of universal beauty, and it's very democratic. So some of the things are, you know, the sculptures from ancient Greece that we all know so well, but other things are come from other cultures, like there's little Peruvian, there's this one that I really, really love that I thought, there's a little sculpture of a woman, there's like an amulet. So we don't know a lot about the history of a lot of those objects, which is obviously
because they could have been women artisan makers, but they would just be unnamed, right?
Exactly. So half of this book could be women.
Well, we'd like to think, but the fact is they remain unnamed, and it's curious to me that so many of the objects in there, or rather so many of the objects you've chosen for your series, shall we say, are women's bodies. So when we look at the ancient Roman works, for example, and of course when I'm acquiring the work, I try and pick those ones because it's very interesting to me, particularly because I put them in the NED, which is a collection which is very much about addressing gender imbalance, and your work there was fantastic. And it's interesting that by the very act, so there's a sort of your work gets to this heart of choice and representation and then reproduction. So, Musée Imaginaire takes all of these things from all over the world and actually is quite forward thinking in its way of bringing them all together from all of these different civilizations, different time spans, different modes of making, puts them all together. And then you select that as your subject. And then within that, you select different images, and then you make your work on top. And then they're viewed in different contexts. So all of these different layers of meaning come into play. And I suppose there are objects here which you could actually just dissect through a purely feminist gaze if you wanted to. And that's the kind of the narrative, which is interesting. And if you were a different artist, so if you were a male artist, or if you were an African American artist, or if you were an Australian artist, the work would again be different. It's interesting because basically what you're showing us is that not only have you shown us that there's no such thing as originality, which you touched upon at the start there, but there's no such thing as neutrality, is there?
Exactly. I'm really, really interested in this at the moment, because it was only a couple of years ago that I realized that I'd been referencing particular artists in great depth, and for a long time, and they are all from art history, and therefore generally they are by men. And I thought, it occurred to me, what does it mean if I take something that's made by a man, from this very male history of art, and appropriate it, or quote it, or work with it, and what does it mean when I change it as a woman, when I take it and I strip it for parts and I make something new? And I'm really interested in that question. I think it's really exciting way of looking at this very pale, very male history of art that we are presented with, or have been presented with, which is thankfully changing and being reevaluated now. So yeah, that's really kind of where I'm going with the theoretical aspect of my practice. What does that mean?
Would you be, this is probably a perverse question, but I can't help but ask, would you be as interested doing this if there was I mean, we could actually take one. So you could take like the WAC exhibition catalogue, which is a groundbreaking exhibition of women artists, which happened in the 80s in California. Traveled, that show, didn't it? It's a fantastic big fat book, WAC. Would you be interested in doing what you're doing to that book? Is it interesting for you to put your Anne-Marie James on this history of all these women artists, or is it more pertinent for you to look at things which have effectively the kind of the male gaze?
It's a really good question. And yeah, I know the book you're talking about, Susan Hiller, one of my all-time heroes.
Love Susan Hiller, yeah.
It was in that.
That's great.
And I just feel like it doesn't need me to do that with it. I think it's much more, as you say, pertinent for me to look at this male gaze and work with it, and yeah, that needs addressing.
Yeah.
I think the work.
So you're quite sort of purposeful in the things that you choose. So you've made reference to Hokusai there, and you've looked at Dura as well, who are two fantastically interesting artists, but quite different. I mean, very for me, the things that unites them is that they're very well circulated artists. Like their work has been seen probably before the modern era by more people than any other artist, because they both exploited the printing press so cleverly. And we have evidence that those things were seen in 2 or 3 different continents while the artist was still alive, which is fantastically interesting. What was it about those artists that was so appealing to you?
Individually, it's the qualities, the formal qualities of the works that I'm appropriating. So for Dura is the line. I'm in love with his line. He's amazing. And Hokusai is equally amazing in his treatment of line. But bringing them together, I do think they have quite a lot in common. They were both fantastically interested in fame. So they were these 2 men who were obsessed with themselves. I mean, Hokusai, I know a little less about his personal motivations, but Dura was totally into himself and fame. And he actually, that little AD monogram that he introduced, That was the subject, I think, of the first copyright lawsuit ever, because forgers routinely copy things work.
Yeah.
And a case was brought, and it was determined that the forgery element was not the entire composition. Copying that was okay. It was adding in the AD monogram that made it a forgery. And so as an artist who's interested in originality and what that means, that was quite a tasty thing to discover. But I was already working with Jira when I found that out. But yeah, I do think they have quite a lot in common, both in terms of line and in terms of sort of use of print to, I don't want to say narcissistic, but yeah, they're two men that are very, very interested.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting.
When you go away on work on things like that, and then you come back to the Musée Imaginaire, does it change your mode of making? Because your first exhibition of this was, what, 2013? I'm imagining that you started working on it now, we could say nearly 10 years ago. So it's a decade of having the museum without walls in your mind, and you've come and gone and done other exhibitions and had other series of work, other bodies of work, which actually look ostensibly quite different, because although you keep coming back to formal qualities, you're very motivated by the line, your work tends to be monochromatic, it tends to be quite focused and singular in its orientation, it's very research based. But the Musée Imaginaire is an exercise in basically putting your hand on something that already exists, whereas what's behind you on the wall is a totally new thing, which may have derived from a source material, but it exists in and of itself. When you go away and make those other bodies of work, do you come back to the Musée Imaginaire a slightly different artist each time?
I sort of come back to Musée Imaginaire when I have an idea of something I want to explore with it, and then I'll make a whole bunch of work based on it. So just after I had my daughter, for example, I was really interested in the depictions of motherhood throughout the book, because there's a lot of Christian art in there. So there's a lot of Madonna and Child. So I think there's always something that's going on, or something I'm interested in exploring technically.
Yeah.
Collages, I wanted to make collages. I have the perfect thing for that. I'll make some Musée Imaginaire collages and just use that as a framework to explore something that is interesting me, either technically or conceptually.
Do you think it's quite a comforting thing to have this ongoing series? I think some artists, they finish a body of work for a show and then they're like, what's next? The studio's empty and they've got to keep going. And there's always a bit of a come down after a show anyway, I think, for a lot of people. But you have this sort of familiar friend sat in the corner of the studio, like, hi. Is it comforting, or is it a bit intimidating? I mean, because you could be going for another 10 years, love. I mean, there's like 700 works.
I love work, and I love creating work for myself, it would seem. And so the idea of having something to always work on is incredibly comforting for me. And at the same time, these are very simple to work on, because you can actually sit because of the scale, you can sit in a chair in the house, not necessarily in the studio, but often in the studio. Not so much for collages, because they're very intricate and delicate and have to be done in the studio, but you can sit and have a conversation with a work of art with just a pen and some ink anywhere.
Do you think it's made you better at experiencing art in the flesh? Because I know that Maru wasn't interested in sort of saying this, does away with the need to go to the British Museum or to go to Easter Island. He wasn't saying that. He was actually very interested in using these reproductions, these plates, which, we have to remember were still relatively new phenomenon to have that kind of quality of photography then. Which are nothing by today's standards, but he was using it almost to advocate that people would experience art in the flesh. He was very interested in people watching art on telly. He probably would love the internet, I think. Do you think that it's made you better at appreciating things in the flesh? You must get really excited when you go to a museum or a gallery and you see one of the things from the book in real life, like you're kind of hunting them out.
I literally have gone hunting for them, and I found one in the Sainsbury collection, because I felt like there was so much in common between Malraux and the way that the Sainsbury Centre for Visual Arts, the way that their collection is laid out, which is very similar. They bring together all different kinds of art, and there are very minimal labels, and everything is mixed up together. There's no different sections. And I felt like, oh, there must be one here. And I've been having a sort of ongoing conversation with the head of the collection there, Calvin Winner. And so I said, can I have a look at the catalogue of the Sainsbury Centre, which is not something you can buy in the gift shop. It's like 2 volumes, it's massive. It's quite a rare book now, I think. And so I went through them all and found that they did have one that's in here. And I was so excited.
I bet you were.
Very excited. It is a really exciting thing. And there's also one that's not identical, but it's very, very similar. And it is a little Peruvian figure. And I thought that from the way Malraux shows it in this book, it looks like a massive sculpture, like something from not something from Easter Island, but life-size, body-sized or bigger. And they have something very, very similar, but not exactly the same in the Sainsbury collection, and it is this big.
Oh,
I love it.
That's really sweet.
But yeah, this book is all about editing, really, and he has got a voice in it, because there's lots of very dramatic lighting. There's lots of, everything's very heavily cropped around the face, so you often don't see the whole of the sculpture. You just see the face. Mm-hmm. And that was one of my motives as well when I first started looking through it, was, oh my God, this is all really heavily cropped around here. And usually I work with, at the time when I started working with it, I was hunting for bodies, useful bodies that I could use and leave the face out, because the face tells you pretty much everything about an artwork, or a lot anyway. And I was looking for dynamic figures that could be almost anybody. And here I had to confront the face and how to work with it, because a lot of them you just can't avoid it.
So you spend a lot of time looking at them. We now think of him with this museum without walls. I think he'll probably come more into common parlance because everyone around the world is wrestling with the legacy of the pandemic. I mean, we're still in it now, but museums have been changed permanently, and our experience of art has been changed. We've sort of fast forwarded into a digital age where online exhibitions are normal, and that actually they're nice and you can appreciate them, and there's content made around them. And I think we're much more digitally savvy than we were even just a year ago in terms of viewing art. Do you think that you personally have sort of learned something new in this last year in the pandemic about viewing art and about the kind of virtual experience of art that you're going to take back to the Musee Imaginaire as you carry on working on it? It's almost like there's a kind of post-COVID body of work there.
I don't know. I feel like it's more the approach that I had before just sort of fits even better in some ways. Mm-hmm. However, I think it's more like the specialness of visiting a gallery and visiting a museum. And what I've been doing since I have Edie, in fact, my daughter, is really slowing down about seeing shows. And I used to go orienteering almost. I'd get that gallery map and I'd go and see everything that interested me. I'd go through it, highlight everything that interested me. And a friend and I would go and see, 20 galleries in a day sometimes, or, which is very doable in London. And now I like to see one show and see it well, and then maybe a couple of other things. And I think that it's just post-pandemic, it'll probably be even more deeper dive into the one thing that I really want to see.
Yeah.
And a little bit of, gallery hopping as well to see new things that are unexpected. But when you really want to, I was so gutted to miss the Artemisia show, for example. So I bought the catalogue. It's not the same. It's a beautiful book, but being unable to go to London last year to see it stung quite a bit.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think that probably hopefully, if we're positive about it, we're going to have the best of both worlds, an appetite to see things in the flesh, to step into those galleries again, commercial galleries, to go to museums and see these great shows like, like Artemisia that was on last year. but also that we'll be very open to sort of online experiences, which allows us to be global and connect in a way that we can't otherwise. And, you know, that's better for the environment anyway. So I think I think it's particularly interesting having the Musee Imaginaire, which is all about this museum in a book, you know, put together, you know, 1957, refashioned by you, and now seen online during a pandemic when we can't see art. I think it's a perfect exhibition for now, and I congratulate you on it. I love this body of work, Anne-Marie. I love it.